Hello, my name is Tim Guthrie. I am an English Composition 1 and 2 tutor, and today we're going to be talking about persuasion using logos, pathos, and ethos. The impact of tone in writing. A writer's tone can vastly affect how the intended or unintended audience perceive their work. For instance, if one is writing an opinion piece, a writer may utilize a tone of passion or use emotions, such as sadness or anger, to better communicate their point. For pieces more grounded in facts and evidence, a writer may adopt a more professional tone, placing their personal feelings on the back burner in favor of a proof-based approach. So, a writer's tone can implicate many things about the subject which they are writing. Typically, if a writer is writing an opinion piece, there is room for them to interject their personal feelings and opinions, hence the name. However, if you're writing solely based on facts, like a scientific paper, it is best that you avoid interjecting your own personal opinion if you don't have the expertise to do so. The 4 rhetorical appeals. The 4 major rhetorical appeals that writers utilize, sometimes unconsciously, are known as logos, pathos, ethos, and kairos. However, the 3 most emphasized rhetorical appeals are logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos is an appeal to logic, often used in research essays where the writer is attempting to convince the audience of their proposed stance by using factual evidence to support their stance or to disprove any counterarguments against said stance. So typically, whenever a writer is trying to appeal to an audience's logos, they're appealing to their logic and reasonable thinking by using not only evidence to support their claim, but cited sources to better support their argument. Ethos is an appeal to ethics, often used by writers to convince the audience of their credibility or to bolster the contents of their character. This is often used in research pieces or scientific papers, wherein a writer may cite their own expertise or use a source or quote from a certified expert, such as a doctor or scientist, to support their claims. Typically, whenever a writer is trying to appeal to the audience's ethos, they're utilizing their own expertise or the expertise of someone else to make their argument appear more credible and as though it has more sources backing it up, and thus convincing the audience to better agree with their argument. Pathos is an appeal to emotion, utilized by a writer to invoke empathy from their audience, either via the use of a hypothetical or an otherwise touching story. Most commonly, the appeal to pathos is present within the hook statement of an essay, which we discussed in my previous video, but depending on the structure or intent of the essay, one may utilize pathos in other areas of their work, such as the conclusion or during the proposal of their argument. So typically, whenever someone uses pathos, they're either creating a fictional hypothetical story as to the potential consequences of not supporting their opinion, such as, let's say, the repeal of Section 230, which I also discussed in my previous video, where a dystopian future is described for the internet in the event that Section 230 is repealed because it is so important to the internet's current state. So they're appealing to your emotions by saying, this should be preserved because without it, this would happen. Hence the hypothetical. A use of a touching story in one's essay to appeal to pathos could be a real story, an account of something that actually happened to someone, like an unfortunate accident or a death in the family. Those tools are very useful in appealing to an audience's pathos. Kairos simply refers to what the writer or author believes is the most opportune time and place to write or publish a piece, covering a potentially controversial topic, and how to best navigate and express their feelings on the topic in the most time-sensitive manner possible. So while logos, ethos, and pathos are very straightforward in their intent, kairos is more of a secondary consideration. While logos is an appeal to logic, ethos an appeal to ethics, and pathos an appeal to emotion, kairos is simply the secondary thought process that goes through a writer's mind as to the timely nature of the piece they are writing in relation to any sort of event that might have occurred recently that does not have a lot of reporting or evidence yet, or a developing story. So it is important to keep these things in mind whenever you're writing, especially about like a controversial topic such as abortion or women's rights, especially like in a developing legal landscape such as the one we have today. So you have logos, ethos, pathos, and kairos. However, the most commonly used are pathos, ethos, and logos. When to utilize each individual rhetorical appeal. Determining when to best utilize each rhetorical appeal can sometimes be difficult to parse, especially depending on the structure and subject of one's essay. However, through some simplification, the burden of figuring out which appeal to use may lift. So, logos in an essay is best implemented in research essays, position essays, proposal essays, or essays which rely a lot upon external resources and research as a crutch to support the basis of the idea the author is attempting to communicate through their essay. For example, quote, "Dogs are capable of voting because according to name, source, etc., direct quote," end quote. So basically, to appeal to someone's logos, the author must utilize a lot of research and external resources. Oftentimes, they are going to use a direct quote, followed by a citation. A majority of logos in essays is also utilized through what is called the sources cited page at the very end of one's essay. So typically, in an essay leaning more towards appealing to the audience's logos, a majority of the time, there will be a sources cited page at the very end that is filled with informational resources and not just personal interjections and the like. Ethos is best implemented in research essays, position essays, and proposal essays, where, similarly to logos, there is an emphasis placed on either the credibility of the author or the sources an author may be citing. For example, quote, "I am a 10-time award-winning dog rights activist appearing on news broadcasts like News Source and News Source." So basically, an appeal to ethos is an appeal to one's credibility. So you want to communicate to your audience that either you are a professional and you know what you're talking about, or the information you are citing, like an external source, is certified as well. So before you cite someone's work, you have to specify who it is you're citing by saying, perhaps, according to John Doe, professor at blah, blah, blah university and 10-time award-winning human rights activist, quote. So it's good to specify who you're citing in order to better allow your audience to understand the importance and expertise of the subject through which your essay is communicating. Pathos is best implemented in opinion pieces and position essays, seeing as both pieces require the author's interjected perspective to act as a crux for its structure. Pathos relies less on logic and more upon utilizing any means necessary to compel an audience to feel an intended emotion. For example, how would you feel if you were a dog and you couldn't elect your own representatives? What that's doing is it's trying to get the audience to feel something for the subject of whom they are writing about. And by using that sort of language, oftentimes it can be manipulative. They are thus gearing their audience to caring more about the subject they are writing about, no matter what it's about. It could be about anything in the world. Whenever the author is directly speaking to the audience using second-person terms, that is an appeal to the audience's pathos and can often be manipulative. Kairos in an essay. As previously discussed, rather than an active appeal to rhetoric, Kairos acts as a secondary machine to the crux of the author's essay. informing the author as to whether or not the contents of their essay or the time at which they choose to publish said essay is appropriate, given the potentially controversial topic said essay may discuss in further detail. As such, one may skirt around some details or avoid projecting their opinion if the topic or incident in question is still developing. So Kairos, in essence, is simply the author's attention to the sensitivity of a topic, or whether or not they should write about said topic. In some of your classes, you may be instructed to write an essay on a currently occurring controversial issue. So it is important to keep Kairos in mind while you are sifting through either recent news or popular controversial topics that are widely argued. When not to use certain rhetorical appeals. It goes without saying that utilizing an appeal such as Pathos in a research paper solely based around evidence is wildly inappropriate. Equally as such, utilizing Logos in an opinion paper with little to no room for personal interjection is also inappropriate, and attempting to persuade your audience of your stance would only become more difficult. Thus, it is important to decide which mode of rhetorical appeal would best benefit the subject around which you are writing your essay before the drafting process begins, just to make it easier on yourself. So let's say your professor asks you to write a rhetorical analysis. Since this is a rhetorical analysis, you may have to appeal to both Logos, depending on what sources you're citing and what topic you are writing about, and / or the audience's Pathos, which appeals to their emotions, depending on how passionately you feel about the subject you are writing about. However, it's important to parse out which exactly would best benefit the subject of your essay before you start writing. In conclusion, there are many modes and vehicles through which you can write your essay, and there are many different appeals that you might need to consider before writing. And depending on what kind of essay you're writing and your perspective towards the matter, your personal opinion, regardless of whether or not you're writing an opinion piece or a scientific paper, the appeals of Logos, Pathos, and Ethos need to be